Welcome to episode 9 of the Liberty Itch podcast. Our guest today is Gigi Foster. Gigi is a professor of economics at the University of New South Wales and senior scholar at the Brownstone Institute. Unusually for a Western University professor in 2025, Gigi's hair is not blue or green. She is a staunch libertarian, highly critical of government, and was an early vocal critic of the government's appalling response to the global COVID con. She co-authored The Great COVID Panic in 2021, which was one of the earliest books to document the lies, irrationality, and ridiculousness of the global hysteria over a mediocre flu. So the current view of COVID is where we kicked off the interview. When I say we, I mean Tom. I could not be trusted to control myself discussing the COVID sham. So to spare you and Gigi from me potentially ranting uncontrollably about the communists and the Victorian government and how I understand that as a libertarian I am opposed to capital punishment, but Dan Andrews... Anyway, Tom interviewed Gigi, and his first question was how she thinks the world now views the COVID sham in hindsight. Have her colleagues started talking to her again? And what is the potential meaning of fellow COVID critic Jay Bhattacharya being confirmed to head the US National Institute of Health?
Be 5 years now. I can't believe that's true, but 5 years. And we've had a lot of goals along the way. We've had a lot of reports that have admitted, in fact, that there were many costs of lockdowns that were not being accounted for at the time by those implementing them. Even as early as, I think, 2022, there was a report here in Australia called something like, what was it? It was fault lines, like as in finding fault lines. It was commissioned by a philanthropic organization of some sort. And it was, very careful to document a lot of harms, particularly from the school closures and from the extended lockdowns. Now, there have also been 3 cost-benefit analyses of the lockdowns in Australia, of which obviously one I've written with Sanjeev Sablok, do lockdowns and border closures serve the greater good, but also 2 other ones, not by government economists or government voices of any sort, but by independent analysts using different approaches, different currencies, and all 3 of us find that the lockdowns were hideously costly. So I suppose, and Jay has been a friend for a long time. I mean, he came out here to do a tour in, I think it was 2022 or 23. I even spoke with him at the New South Wales Parliament. I spoke on John Anderson's podcast with him about the lockdowns and the vaccines and whatnot. So very familiar with his work, and we're all very happy that he has been confirmed. I think Jay is a unique kind of candidate, a unique persona in a sense, though, because he is first of all associated with a mainline reputable university in the US, Stanford, and he has both an MD and a PhD in economics. So he is sort of incredibly qualified to talk about the health costs and economic costs of the lockdowns. And many of us during COVID were told to stay silent because we weren't health professionals and therefore we didn't have the right to have an opinion about the economic effects of lockdowns, which always struck me as a bizarre question or bizarre position to take. But Jay isn't vulnerable to that kind of criticism. And he also has been rather moderate in his views and expresses his views in a moderate fashion. So, for example, on the vaccines, when I was on John Anderson's podcast with him, I remember very clearly I was much more negative on the efficacy and safety of the vaccines than he was. And I'm not sure whether he was ever in favor of mandates, but I don't think he was nearly as critical of vaccines. So he won't be seen as much of a threat, I think, to the big pharmaceutical, conglomerate that has obviously, controlled a lot of decisions in this area as somebody like I would be, for example, because of his history and how he has spoken about particularly the vaccine issue. And I think the lockdowns just weren't, I mean, there's no serious, robust cost-benefit analysis that has ever been done on lockdowns or quarantines that says in practice they actually save lives on net. There's just none because you can't, if you use real data, you can't. The only way you can get that answer is by claiming that your simulation, a model, is science, and then just spouting whatever the model says, which is, of course, a function of the assumptions you feed into it as the God's honest truth. So, that's just not science in my mind. That's just dogma.
Yeah, I do remember during the Victorian lockdown, you could download their model and run it on your computer, but they said you needed a supercomputer, which probably is a normal laptop that costs $10,000 because it was procured by government. But I ran the model myself, and every conclusion was it grows exponentially. So um, in my conclusion, I was like, well, what's the point?
Well, this is the problem. If you look at, and I've criticized some of these SIR models, particularly. I mean, I've gone in detail back to the authors and said, here are the problems. That the main problem is that there's just huge swaths of areas and dimensions of life that are affected by lockdowns that are not included anywhere in the model. The model doesn't have school closures. It doesn't have human capital formation of children. It doesn't have mental health collateral damage. It doesn't have all the debt that gets expended by governments trying to put a wrap around the damage of lockdowns, right? So all of these things that we know matter, that are the core line items of cost in my cost benefit analysis, and others as well around the world, just don't appear, right? So it's almost like this
Hmm.
tunnel vision, la la la. The only thing that matters is COVID, and COVID only matters in the way that I specify it to matter in my model, which, as you say, often puts in completely unrealistic, biologically unrealistic assumptions, such as exponential growth in things where we know that nature has a homeostatic sort of property. And once people get an immunity, that you tend to see a leveling off of infection rates, transmission rates, and severity as well, particularly for coronaviruses or other respiratory viruses. So we know that that's the direction of travel for natural evolution of these sorts of bugs. But that was never in any of these models, right? So it's biologically inaccurate and incomplete most of the time. I mean, all of the models like that I've seen have had those features, which is it's very disappointing, given the amazing, incredible, draconian impacts that these policies have had on Australians.
Which I find quite interesting, because down here in Victoria, we accuse our fellow Victorians of having Stockholm syndrome. We re-elected Premier Daniel Andrews for a third term, which he left quite unceremoniously, even though he promised a lot of things, quite frankly. But there was a recent survey. I think it was 55% of people in Australia still back mandates, which I find astonishing.
Yeah, I know. Well, but you have to understand the psychology of this, right? I mean, I've written about this a bit in The Great COVID Panic, which was,
Hmm.
as you probably know, Brownstone Institute's first book back in 2021. And I really stand by what we wrote then. I mean, it's really stood the test of time. But we have a chapter on crowd psychology and sort of how one's thinking brain gets swept up by this herd mentality at times of crisis when one is vulnerable, and particularly being very fearful is a way to be very vulnerable, right, psychologically. And people then did things in that framework, in that mindset, which directly damaged those they love. I mean, that just happened. People across Australia will have aided and abetted destruction through enforcing and themselves modeling just behaviors and requirements and protocols and whatnot that were antithetical to human well-being. And so now there's a huge psychological cost to facing that reality, because it means that you have to confront the fact that even though you thought you were being a good person, that's why I think a lot of people did these things. They followed along because they thought that was the right thing to do, because they love each other, they love their children and their parents, and they thought this was how you protect them. But now to realize, oh, I actually was manipulated into doing destructive activities. I hurt the people I loved when I thought I was, doing the right thing, and I was had by people in government. I was had by those in power. Who can I trust now? Right? It first of all destroys your image of yourself as someone who has principles and can, function independently in the world and do the right thing and not just become a pawn of those in power and help to destroy society. But also, it kind of pulls the rug out from under you in terms of your vision of how the world works and what you can trust in this world, right? And a lot of people still put a lot of trust in government in Australia, right? They've been indoctrinated into that attitude, and there's a very uncritical approach that people take towards almost anybody in political, or bureaucratic power. I mean, there's a lot of lip service. Oh, those stupid politicians. But at the end of the day, most people still go out and they vote for somebody in Labor, somebody in Liberal. They don't look for outside candidates. They don't look for candidates that are, new and not in the system. And so that tells you they don't really understand the degree of entrenchment of power and privilege that is taking decision making and welfare away from the Australian people.
It's interesting you say that, because the primary vote for Labor, when they got in federally, was at the lowest since, I think, federation. It could be federation. Definitely since World War II. But at the same token, there's this, like you said, Milton Friedman once said, the capitalist has its self interest, but politicians are self interested too, just as much. Why do you think there is that massive disconnect between, especially politicians on the left? And when I see politicians on the left, like the Greens or stuff, they're doing the right thing. They care for people. That seems to be the mantra of the left, that they care. Whereas liberal or right of centre parties don't care. And I think Jonathan Haidt said there's 5 locuses of, how do you say, moral frameworks. And I suppose, is it just a mismatch of moral frameworks? Because in my mind, if I'm going to be a greenie, I'm going to have to hold a gun to someone's head and take their property to redistribute it. But they don't see it that way. Why do you think there's still that trust of government? Is it a case of people don't know how the sausage? People don't know how the sausage is made, and they just seem to be, okay, well, I'll vote for them.
Yeah, look, that's a very complicated question. And there's a lot to unpack in what you said. I think there is fundamentally quite a shallow perception in the Australian mind of how politics operates, how economic systems operate. I've said on Sky News multiple times, I think that the level of economic literacy in the country is very low. And that's one of the reasons why governments, whatever the government is of the day, can get away with the kinds of spin stories that they regularly, spout through the mainstream media, particularly around budget. The budget's coming up, obviously, now, and we're all expecting, well, I'm certainly expecting that it's going to be full of handouts to various groups to essentially enable the government to virtue signal and say, we care. We care about these people. We care about those people. We care about that group and this challenge and that challenge. And the only language that Australians are used to hearing from the politicians, and perhaps it's the only language they really understand, is the language of handouts. I'm giving you a rebate. I'm putting more money into aged care. I'm giving money to blah, right? It's all this handout. There's no concept of the possibility even that government through its actions may actually be holding the economy back in some ways, and therefore structurally helping to create the very crises that the politicians purport to be fixing, right? So, I just did a study for the Center for Independent Studies. It's in draft at the moment, of the childcare sector. And my goodness, if you had to pick a sector that is riddled with regulation and requirements and red tape, that is almost surely keeping people out of that supply chain, basically, women who might become family daycarers who just don't, because it looks like, a Kafka-esque nightmare just to become a family daycare provider, right? That's a good example where people think that you fix the childcare problem by spending more money on it. Maybe you just can help by retrenching a little bit, drawing back the government intervention. But that's just not in the psyche of people, right? So they're used to this narrative of, if we have an economic problem, we need to look to government and we need to expect them to fix it with a particular key action. In the case of the RBA, that action is to bring down rates, right? In the case of the fiscal policy, it's give me some money to help me with my cost of living. It's rare to find someone really holding the government to account from the lay populace, saying, hey, I want my politician to really think about the structural problems we have in this country that might be holding back productivity and innovation and experimentation. And, that's really where growth comes from ultimately. And so we want government to get out of the way of that. I've almost never heard that. I've only heard that sort of argument at like a libertarian conference, right? So I think there's a lack of real understanding. I teach economics here at UNSW, and I try to provide some of that deeper understanding of the mechanisms in the economy and this notion of distributed knowledge. And you can't really know everything at the center. So expecting an answer from the center is just, it's insane, right? You have a particular role for the government, sure, but everybody has to agree on that, and it's reasonably limited and there's some things it just can't do because it can't know what is necessary to know, and every choice it makes is going to be, human and fallible. But yeah, there is this Stockholm syndrome, and if you ask me where it comes from in Australia, because we don't have it quite as much in the US where I come from, I would say probably there is a bit of a role to play by just looking at Australia's history. The fact that people came here not just as convicts, but as convicts with the bobbies together with them on the boats. and they got to a land which was quite foreign, and people needed help setting stuff up and not starving, right? And so I think they looked to authority, which was the authority they brought along with them with Britain, from Britain, to help them with that. And so there's a kind of a cultural habit, I suppose, of,
Mm.
of looking to authority, to those in authority when things get tough, despite the self-image of the larrikin and the sort of outlaw type. Yeah, well, but when the going gets really tough, we still look to daddy. We still do.
Mm. Yeah, it is interesting you say that because Chris Watson, the third Prime Minister of Australia, was considered the first democratic socialist government ever elected in the Western world. And we've had this long history of being a workers' paradise. We've had conciliation and arbitration baked into our social fabric since quite the beginning. And if you look at cartoons from the time, it's always complaints about we need a living wage, we need some kind of government regulation around wages and things like that. Do you think if it's so enraveled in our collective civil society, is it just almost impossible to get rid of at this point? Is there any hope for that?
I do hold out hope, mainly because Australia is a nation of immigrants, and many of the people who actually fought the COVID policies in the last 5 years have been themselves immigrants. Not everybody, right? There are some Australians who also have, saw that this was wrong, but a good number of us have experience elsewhere. Some of the most fiery anti-lockdown people I know were actually part of Eastern Europe, before they immigrated over to Australia. One guy swam across a river to escape Hungary when he was like 21 or something, and he's just become the most strident advocate of freedom of speech. And he's a bit cynical, I guess, now, but at least he's here. So there is a fraction of Australia who, we are Australians. I came here, I was naturalized Australian, I don't know, gosh, must have been almost nearly 20 years ago now. I love this country. My kids were raised here. They have Australian accents, we can play rhyming games and stuff, but I don't always win. But I really care about the country, but I also have a perspective that is maybe a little different because I was raised and I was in the US for formative years. And so I could see the difference in levels of trust of government, and also the difference in confidence in self. The Americans back themselves, right or wrong with their policy settings. They are their own advocates, right? They are their own best advocates. And they're not ashamed of it, right? They're very patriotic, and they believe in themselves. Australians have this perpetual chip on the shoulder about themselves. They don't back themselves. They always want to look somewhere else to see how it could be done. They never believe they could be the ones to do it, to make something new, to make something different, to discover something great, or to just take care of themselves, instead of needing to look to how does the UK do it, or what does my government say, or some other authority figure. So there is this kind of, lack of confidence. I find that one of the most tedious parts of the Australian culture, and most tragic as well, because there's so much that's wonderful about this country's culture and its resources and the mateship, and just the potential of the people. It's such a waste to see, people not backing themselves. So I think we need to kind of stoke that. We need to stoke confidence in self and confidence in our own communities. And in some cases, that may be that we need to sort of take a leaf out of some other cultures, including maybe the US or some of the kind of, ex-Soviet republic sort of attitudes of, we know how power can get. We know what corruption looks like, and we don't want that here, and have that kind of be the undergirding, intellectually of a renewed sense of community strength and a renewed sense of the importance of strong communities as a bulwark against overreach by the government, because that's really what it is. It's not that we don't want government at all. At least most people, there are the anarcho-capitalists of the world, but, most people in Australia, I think, would say that there is some role for government, building roads or, national defense, these kinds of things. But we need to be aware that we are the stewards of our societies, not the government. The government is supposed to be our servant in stewarding our societies. And if they're seen to be failing in that mission, we need to protest and we need to fight back. And how do we fight back? We can't fight back individually. It must be in groups. It must be in our communities. So that's basically, a lot of what I've been focusing on we've been focusing on in Australians for Science and Freedom in the last couple of years is to try to empower communities with information and sort of channels through which they can try to have their voice heard in the various areas that are important to them, whether it's health or education or politics or the media. There are a lot of areas where we need to really say that we don't think that the current settings are good, and we'd like to see some reform. And we need to say this is the reform direction that we'd like, which is another thing ASF has been working on. What would a good health system look like? What would a good education system look like? Because somebody needs to draw up those blueprints, and I can tell you right now, it's not going to be those who are presently in power.
It's interesting you talk about communities, and I wouldn't say that Australia has a culture of bowling alone, to quote that book, but can't remember who wrote it. But the one thing that struck me throughout sort of the last 5-10 years is that when the last straw, I think, was when sports and recreation was taken away. So the government sort of scrambled to bring back the AFL, Australian rules football, at least put it on television, because I think if you took that away, then people would have really risen up, I think. But there is still a healthy sporting culture, but it doesn't really translate to community building outside of that. It's like we go to the footy, have a few drinks, go home. But do you think that's maybe the last bastion of that community building in Australia? I mean, we love our sports, but it doesn't really translate to any meaningful, I guess, political discussion.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really interesting example, actually. And it's something I cover in one of my earlier books about essentially how networks of various sorts, economic networks or community networks or any other kind of network, can eventually be used to exchange information about political matters and therefore serve as a bulwark against overreach by people in authority. But yeah, you don't see that happening as much in Australia, and I think it's because of this shared attitude that the government's probably going to take care of us. You don't see. It's hard to start a conversation at a football club about how you think maybe your kids were harmed by the lockdowns, right? It sort of seems like you're almost. I mean, it would feel, I think, like you were hijacking that connection to talk about something, to push an agenda or something, right? Which is unfortunate because, again, it's this mindset. We are the ones who need to be on the lookout. We need to be watchful about what's happening in the halls of power in order to, have any sort of credibility when we say that we're a democracy, right? So, like, it's our role. We should be doing that. And I think we do have the sports network to fall back on and some other ones. I mean, there are religious networks around the place, although, of course, many churches and other places of worship closed during lockdowns, but there were some that were open, and those are, in some sections of the community, quite strong influences on their sort of ability to, I suppose, operate in the economy without looking always to the government. So, in terms of help to find jobs or, childcare or partners or whatever, it's locally determined. There's a local risk sharing, so kind of insurance. A lot of things can be done locally that otherwise, you'd have to look beyond the local community to do. So I like what some of the churches are doing, but of course, if you're not a religious person, then what do? Maybe you go to sports, but there's not really that same kind of ecosystem of support around the sports communities. So yeah, so I mean, that is definitely something that we're thinking about how to invigorate in this country and how to get people actually activated around some of the issues that directly affect them. One of the problems, again, is that we are such a lucky country that we still have a lot of resources and we burn them regularly. Right. And we see this in just the complete reactionary nonsense that we see out of the government sometimes. I mean, that business of, pulling the sports and then putting them back on because people were complaining. Did nobody think about that, before they went ahead and rolled it out? It's like the classic IT joke. They roll out a software update, everything fails, and then they roll it back again. User test it first, and in the case of policymaking, just have somebody who has a brain, look at it and think about the impact on society before you, just inflict it on everyone. And then you react like a scared kangaroo from the political uprising. I mean, that's not leadership. That's reactionary, fig leaf use, right? It's not, I just find it really unconscionable. So that kind of, burning of resources, this back and forth. Oops, well, sorry, we'll have to do this instead, right? And it's just showing a lack of competence. And then the resource burning on things like the net zero, nonsense, and some of the other stuff that you've just, you just look at it and you just think, what are we doing? We are able to do it because we're a rich country. And so people aren't really that desperate, unfortunately. And that's, I don't know, unfortunately, I don't want people to be desperate, but you look at, where can you get the impetus? Where can you get the passion from people? Passion comes from seeing something that must be changed, that you feel really committed, has to be changed. And that really, it happens most when people unfortunately are suffering, when they've seen, loved ones hurt, and they can connect the dots, and they say it was the government that hurt my loved one. And so I've seen that in the freedom community, where people have been hurt by the lockdowns, somebody suicided or something, or someone, got hurt by the vaccine, and somebody's son or whatever, and then they are basically a lifelong member of, don't trust the government club. But and you don't want to, we don't wish that on a large number of people, but unfortunately life is still pretty good, even with the cost of living crisis for most people. And if they do feel the pinch with the cost of living crisis, they'll just kind of follow the same habitus, right? Look to the government, ask for handouts, and the government will probably provide, because again, we've got the rich asked to do so. And if all else fails, tell people they can take a distribution from their super, all right? Get out of jail free card for the government anytime.
Which brings me to my next sort of question. The Center for Independent Studies recently, last week, put out a report saying that young people could, if they could access their superannuation, it could help them into the housing market, but potentially get them better houses, better quality houses, better locations, and things like that, and improve their retirement outcomes. And I suppose we were talking about it just before, but it seems like there's no pushback from the general populace, because people think, well, superannuation, it's already set up for me. It's this paternalistic top-down mandate that it's like, 12% goes into my wages, I don't have to think about it. So do you think we'll ever see a mass pushback against superannuation?
It's really hard to see that. I think you'd have to get an extremely reform-minded government in place, and they'd have to have a really good grandfathering plan, which would make people who have been in the system for a long time not feel like they were losing out, and would make the new ones coming up not feel that they were being left to sink or swim on their own merits. And just allowing people to take distributions from super in order to buy a house, that's not doing anything about house prices, right? That's actually, if anything, going to put upward pressure on house prices. And it's almost like, like an abuser who says, okay, I'll let you, have dessert this time, but next time I'm not going to promise anything, right? So it's like a special favor, a special handout. It's just, I don't like the whole mental model of that, right? It's like, here's your money, and I'm going to let you use a little bit of it because I'm a kind person today, right? Yuck, right? We do it very differently in the US, where we also have tax advantage savings for retirement, and I certainly wouldn't want to discourage that. I think that's something we should be encouraging people to think about more than they otherwise would when they're young. I think that's a positive thing. But I also believe in people's ability to make choices that are best for themselves and their families. I just believe in that. I think people are motivated to do that. And if you give them the freedom to do that, generally speaking, they will. Even if you're putting in place a few nudges here and there, not coercion, but just nudges. Hey, think about retirement. And so, you'll get people doing what is best for their family, whether that's buying a house when they're 21, or, putting your kids through school when you're 30, or whatever the thing is, helping your older mother when you're 40. There are different expenses that come up differently at different times, unexpectedly sometimes, in different people's lives. And how are they supposed to handle that, particularly when there needs to be a large influx of cash, when a lot of Australians, their wealth is mainly tied up in super. And they can't access it for any other purpose. So but that obviously the system it's not set up for you. It's set up for the money managers. Let's just make that clear. But I don't think it's going to go away anytime soon, unfortunately. As much as I think Australia would be better off if it did.
I think if we told a subset of teenage boys or men coming to get their license, if they could buy a fully sick V8 with their super, I think they'd be on board with it. Maybe. But we've talked about that the money managers and the bureaucrats seem to be the main beneficiaries of super. You talked about that Denmark's money managers have 0.1%. and we charge 1%, which is, exponentially higher. And when we see those ads with the low fees and stuff, if people knew about how low fees could be, I think they'd kind of riot,
Yeah.
wouldn't they?
Yeah, I mean, I think people don't do their research generally. And of course, superannuation funds do differ depending on what you're in, right? There are some that are better than 1%, but it's sort of, that was an average that
Yeah.
came out of some work of Cameron Murray's back a few years ago. But yeah, people, I think generally, again, it's this sort of automatic habit of trusting the government. They don't really feel they need to do any of their own research, and some of them don't even know how. Again, the low economic literacy means a lot of people wouldn't know where to start in sort of doing research about how much different funds charge, or what the possibilities might be in terms of other countries that have also had the same problem, of course, because they also have people who work for a while and then have to retire, right? So this problem has been solved differently in many, many different ways across the West, and we have lots of examples to pull from. But a lot of people, they don't think they feel confident. Again, it's this confidence in self. I can figure this out, right? I mean, Americans just are just higher in that, whatever that stock is of backing the self. A lot of people, I think, being pitched to by Australian politicians already don't feel very confident, and then the way that the politicians speak to them, it's almost like a master speaking to a slave sometimes, and so it just keeps them in that box of, okay, I guess I have to just do what the government says. I'll keep my head down. It's very disturbing. If once you see it, that kind of dynamic, it's kind of hard to unsee it, and very, very unpleasant. So yeah, I'm not sure. I do think that maybe this new feature that has been popping up on Google searches and other searches now with generative AI or whatever, that's you can just type in a question and you get sort of a boilerplate answer, is not always right. But I would say, I mean, in my experience, 80% of the time, it's got some useful information in it. And that might help people to start feeling like they can claw their way into a more informed position on some policy matters than they used to have. The problem, of course, is AI is only trained on, what's published and out there and easily accessible. So it doesn't include a lot of information that's sort of on the underbelly of the web, and not favored or has been censored. So you still don't get a really unbiased view, but at least it's a starting point for some issues. So yeah, I would encourage your listeners to try that out. If you're really not sure of what to do, just ask a question in Google now. You'll get some interesting information and follow your nose. You're probably smarter than you think.
Yeah, right. Um, it's interesting you talk about that we're made of different stock, and it could be that we're a nation of convicts and jailers. But I'll never forget when I was in New York and I went into a shoe store, and this kid just comes up to me because I was wearing Chuck Taylors, and if you're not familiar with Chuck Taylors, it's got like a toe which is made out of white rubber, and he goes, "This is the best thing to clean your shoes, guaranteed," and he just starts doing it.
Yeah.
And he goes, "My name's Joe. Go to the counter, say my name, blah, blah, blah." And he was doing that to everybody. And in Australia, that would be so confronting for someone who is trying to, win commissions and be the best that he can be in of all things, a shoe store. And people probably maybe look down on retail workers. I mean, if you go into a supermarket these days, it's like, please treat our workers with respect, which is just insane to me. But it seems to me that there's this class of, I'm working in a good job, screw the rest of it, everyone is sort of beneath me. Or I went to uni. This is another classic example. I went to uni, I'm educated, I know more than everybody else. Do you think there is that sort of two classes for all this talk about Australia being an egalitarian society? Do you think there is a stratified society?
Oh yes, absolutely. I mean, yeah, very palpably, much more so than in the U.S. I spent a couple of years in New York City as well before moving to Australia, and that was a place where you really feel that there's an attitude of equality that permeates the interactions between people. Now, everybody knows that certain members of society are richer or whatever, and you go to certain neighborhoods and you'll see them. But there is, if on the subway, if you just encounter somebody, there's no kind of class overlay of the interaction, or very, very little usually, unless the person is really in an extreme high class, but they probably wouldn't be taking the subway, right? But if it's sort of just generally, working stiffs all the way down to, somebody who is homeless and just having a ride. People will interact with each other respectfully, generally speaking, and not with that class overlay. But here, yeah, definitely. I mean, you see it in the private school system in high schools, right? If you want to be a mover and shaker, you need to go to, Sydney Grammar or Fort Knox or whatever these places are. Not Fort Knox, Knox Grammar, whatever these places are.
Where's
that? It's another one of those big, I don't know, I think it's a selective school in Sydney.
Okay.
I didn't send my kids there, but that's sort of known to be the kinds of places that you need to go in order to become part of this elite, right? Part of the class of people who will eventually be running the society. Mayor of Sydney, or just people who are well connected, who at least know who the mayor of Sydney is, right? And if you're not in that bubble, then you are very much not in the bubble. You're in a different class. And I think there's a huge amount of conceit and hubris that comes along with being in that class. And it's quite offensive. I mean, I went through very elite schools in the US. I went to a private all-girls school when I was in primary school. And then I went to Exeter, which is a very prestigious high school, boarding school in New Hampshire. And then I went to Yale, which is, an Ivy League college. And so I saw lots of elite kind of style behavior, but I guess I have a bit of a reaction to it now because I've seen so much of it. But all of those schools also really heavily emphasized giving to others. Non sibi, not for oneself, was the motto of Exeter. And what was it? Something like in Latin, something that says something like the nature of the person, not the appearance, was the mission of my first school. And then, of course, Yale has the Day of Service, and it's all about service to communities, every May. And I sort of always found those mission statements to be appealing. If you are going to have the advantage of being able to be educated at, what society is proclaiming to be the best institutions, well, you do kind of have a bit of a moral responsibility to give back to your fellow man in some way, and, somehow. And I guess that has motivated my choices about how to spend my time, in my career. But that doesn't mean that I'm better than someone on the street. It means that I've had the opportunity to spend my time to invest in building human capital in various ways that I can now have the privilege of using to help humanity. Right? That's the benefit. It's not that somehow I've joined a club that is now going to, take care of me for the rest of my life, and I can treat everybody else like a non-human. That's very bad. It's horrible, right? But I'd almost see that kind of attitude amongst some people who go through this sort of elite system in Australia. So yeah, that's a big problem. And we have that problem at the global level, the globalist elite sort of that have this incredible conceit about, we're going to figure out, one health. We're going to figure out how to make everybody healthy somehow from the top of the mountains of all countries. WHO is going to work this out. You tell me how health gets created by somebody overseas who has never seen the body of the person that they're supposedly making policy for. That's just not workable, right? I mean, read Hayek if you want to figure out more about why that's not workable. So it's just this deluded fantasy and very dangerous. So that's another thing I've been trying to, draw attention to, an awareness of. And of course, that's something that's quite a common theme amongst the freedom community, is to, not go along with this globalist nonsense that's not responsive to the needs of the actual Australian people.
Mm. And just to touch on education, it's the biggest contradiction in Australian culture. If even the poorest among us, if they had the choice, they would not send their kid to a public school, or they'd say private. That's the best way to get ahead, which I find interesting. Like if people have so much faith in government for goodies and stuff, but they don't have faith in the public school system, which I find interesting.
That is interesting. I mean, for the record, I sent both my kids to public schools and they've done fine, but I was compensating in the home, as you do, for the stuff that, maybe wasn't being offered by the school system. And at that time as well, the ideological capture wasn't quite as bad, I think, as it is now. But the idea is to parent a child who can think for himself, right? That's kind of what you want, and who can figure out who he is, and therefore figure out where to invest in himself and how to invest, what kind of activities and what kind of skills in order to best contribute to the society that he's going to find himself part of, and then have success in whatever manner he deems it to be. And that can definitely be accomplished in some of the public schools. I mean, I was quite happy with the public schools my kids went to. But yeah, this notion that somehow you can't trust what's provided publicly, but yet you can trust the people who provide it. It's a little bit contradictory, but people are a bundle of inconsistencies. That's very normal for humans, and we scientists struggle with that ourselves, right? So you have to constantly be um, confronting your own beliefs at any given moment with other people's beliefs, and really reading into it and trying to understand why is it that people have a different belief about something, or are seeing different data than you've seen, and where is that data coming from? Do I believe that? And you have to constantly check yourself, and that's part of being a critical thinker. So that's another skill I would love to help to raise in Australia. And I mean, I've done a lot of things in that direction. I will mention, since you're asking about education, that I've been for a while, a bit dissatisfied with the higher education sector in Australia, as much as I am employed by one higher educator, and I appreciate their lack of threatening me with any retaliation for what I've said during COVID. That's really wonderful. Thank you, UNSW. But I have also been involved in an experimental new university called Academia Liberamentis, Academy of the Free Mind, which is basically trying to rediscover the way that universities used to operate without so many administrative and bureaucratic layers of oversight and control and compliance and whatnot, which distracts professors away from doing what they do best, which is to actually teach people what they think they know. And to really generate an ability in those students to think critically and freely about the information that's being presented, while still maintaining a respectful attitude, pro-human attitude, of course, and also help them to discover how to be comfortable emotionally and sort of in expressive ways as well, with including music and writing and things like this in the curriculum as well. So we're trying that out in Belgium at the moment. If people are interested, you can visit liberamentis.org, LIBERAMENTIS.org. And I'm actually running a little trial taster weekend sort of boot camp type thing, founded on the pedagogical principles of Academia Liberamentis next month in Avalon for a community that's asked for that. So, I can see doing a few more of those in the next few years, trying to kind of get people's muscles working a bit more in how to be a critical thinker, and some realities about the way the world works that a lot of people won't have heard in their schooling system, whether public or private.
Critical thinking and schooling sort of seem like a contradiction in terms these days. And it's interesting to me, coming through the Australian school system, we have compulsory voting, but political science is not compulsory. We live in a market economy. Economics is not compulsory. I mean, is that a feature or a bug?
I think it depends what your perspective is, right? From my perspective, it's a bug. From the perspective of the political class, perhaps it's a feature. I very much think we should be putting civics into high school and as a compulsory subject. And part of civics is economics, understanding the market system, but also just the give and take between the public and private sectors, and the role of entrepreneurialism, and all sorts of other factors. How you vote, why you vote, how you organize for change at a community level. The way that the big party systems operate, all that stuff. We need to know that, right? We need to know that in order to be effective stewards of our society over time. And so I totally agree with you. And actually, I've been in communication with a couple of different people who are very interested in the same thing. And I'm hopeful that we'll make some progress in this over the next couple of years. But it's not, it's not pill battle. Let me say that. I've tried to get in the room of the place where the economics curriculum is set for New South Wales for approximately 10 years. And just really no interest on their side in consulting. And I'm somebody who's been publishing in education economics and been clearly interested in education, been teaching, nationally awarded teacher, whatever, working at a school of economics, one of the best ones in the state, for what I've been here for 15 years. And and I've indicated my interest, but there's just no interest in real consultation with somebody like me. And I think that's been repeated at other places as well. So the Economic Society and other places that I think should have been consulted just aren't. So there's a closed shop aspect to the way the curriculum is set for our high schoolers, unfortunately. And so cracking that nut, I think has to be the first thing we do before we can actually then start to change curriculum. Or we say, look, fine, if you want to do that, you can, but I'm going to develop a new curriculum over here, and fine, I'll link it to your learning outcomes or whatever you put, but I'm going to just, teach what I think is useful. And then you hope to attract market share.
Absolutely. And what I've been hearing recently, just out and about and with friends and other people online, is that, and I haven't heard it as much as I have in the last few years, is that when the government says we're going to do something, we're going to give you a payment, blah blah blah, they're going to so that's not free money, that's our money being redistributed.
Yep.
Um, Now with the DOGE, Department of Government Efficiency, I think Peter Dutton and the Liberal Party have said that they're going to appoint Jacinta Price, the Australian DOGE, and even if it gets up, I don't have high hopes for it. Do you?
Look, I'd like to believe in the potential for someone in government to actually effectively shake out some of the inefficiencies. I'm sure there are lots of inefficiencies to shake out. I'd like to be hopeful, cautiously optimistic about it. But I mean, the latest Brownstone blog that I wrote with my co-authors on the Great COVID Panic was about sort of what we haven't yet seen from Team Trump in the U.S. And one of our points was that for all of the Doge-led sound and fury that's been happening since the beginning of the year, we've only seen a reduction in the number of government employees by an amount equal to, something like the number in Dallas, one city in the U.S. Right?
Right.
So it's not really that much, actually, and it's just hard to make change in such an interdependent, interwoven, entrenched system. So I see that, and if you try to do it fast and furiously, you're going to make mistakes and people are going to barbecue you for it, as has happened, to Elon. And if you try to go slowly, then you allow time for the entrenched interests to organize and, figure out ways to fight back and defend the various different targets that you might have. So it's a really, really difficult position that they find themselves in over there. And here it will be the same. These political incentives run very deep. I don't think they run quite as deep here as in the U.S., mainly because there's just not as much money in politics here as there is in the U.S. And so I think we may have a slightly better chance. But there's also just a lot more incompetence here. And maybe that makes it easier to just find those who are just taking up, taxpayer money without delivering value and axe them. But I would like to also suggest, if Jacinta is listening, one way to go, instead of just saying, look, here are your pink slips, goodbye, you could say, you're employed by, let's say, the Department of Aged Care or whatever, Department of Health, and you're in the aged care section. Thank you for your service. If you would like to continue in your job, there's a new condition, which is that one day every fortnight you must go to an aged care facility and work there. Help do the work that actually needs to be done by the department that bears this name. And that will help to alleviate some of our aged care crisis, supply side shortages. And you'd also not attract the same kinds of people, I think, to those jobs. And there'd be people voluntarily quitting because they don't want to go into aged care facilities and actually have to get their hands dirty, literally or metaphorically, with the actual work of a department that bears that name. So it's a sort of time taxation of public servants, you might say, but being able to essentially, assist in some way. And also you would, with that kind of action, you would put downward pressure on regulations and compliance oriented stuff that just gets in the way of providing care. So, people may say, well, we couldn't possibly put somebody into an aged care facility who hasn't been through this training and that training and has the Cert 3 and such and such. And the reality is, sorry, but for generations, we took care of our elderly without having a Cert 3 or whatever other thing you think that they need to have. You need to have a little bit of training in a couple things. It'll take a day, and that's it. You should be able to work as an aged care support person, maybe not a specialist in, some area of the body, but certainly a general support person helping them to, shower and toilet and dress and feed our elderly population who badly need it without, all this formal training and compliance sort of stuff. So that would be another, a secondary blow that would be dealt by that kind of system.
It is interesting that it's sort of that this regulatory capture of so many jobs, like even like the university industrial complex, for jobs that just never needed any academic training. Like I went to uni, I got my master's degree in communication media journalism, and I would say 50 years ago, I would just, if there would be a newspaper, I'd be a cadet and I'd go through the ranks. Yeah. And there was no academic requirement really, apart from maybe knowing how to spell properly. But do you think that the university industrial complex, and there's so many bullshit degrees. It's just a way of perpetuating itself. It has and I suppose in Australia as well, to owing back to that stratified environment, it's like if you go to uni, that's a pathway to quote unquote success.
Yep.
Even though so many people will study, vegan feminist dolphin dance interpretation or whatever.
Yeah, that was very creative. Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I've said this many times that we really need much more respect for the non-uni uh, professions, non-uni, trained professions, such as, a bricklayer or an electrician or someone who can figure out how to do their job either on the job in an apprenticeship program or cadetship, as you say, or maybe with some training from TAFE or something. But, we don't need as many students going to university as we have. We have an oversupply of these university educated people, I think. As much as, obviously they're coming to the university, they're helping to employ me, right? So in my own interest, I probably shouldn't say this, but I think it's just true from a social standpoint. We've got way too many people going to uni, and it's partly a reflection of this shallowness of thinking that we started talking about at the beginning. People think, oh, uni is the way to success. Ergo, we must offer uni to many, many more people, right? And so you get this massification, and you saw this under multiple leaders over the last 20 years in Australia, just increasing the caps and the amount of people who could be who could come to take university degrees without a commensurate investment in TAFE or an acknowledgement of the value of on-the-job training to many professions, much more valuable than just classroom learning. And so now what we have is a bunch of people who have just been sold this message that the only way to be successful is go to uni, which is A, not true, and B, again, shallow. It's no longer the only way to be successful if 60% of people are doing it. That's not, it's not like, oh, well, you're going to get the same level of success, whatever that is, that you used to get in 1980 going to university, because then very, very few people went. And so the returns were very different looking than the returns are today. Right. So it's kind of like we have a phrase for this in economics called the Lucas critique, which is, you see a relationship between two variables in the past and you're like, oh, great. I'll just, if it's a positive relationship and I can adjust one of them, well, I'll just go whole hog on adjusting this one and I'll get the same return in this one. No, because people's expectations and the markets and the equilibria completely change. And you end up with, a totally different outcome than you were expecting based on that simple relationship that you just observed without thinking about the re-optimizing behavior of individual agents and on whole markets that results. So so I think, I would love to see more people in TAFE. I'd love to see more respect for just, working with your hands, basically. And geez, I'd love to be able to find an electrician who's good and not so expensive quickly.
Yeah, good luck with that. Sorry, but not sorry, but it's true. But it's interesting that university, that so many people go to university, sort of create this glut or over production of elites or those who think they're elite, and ergo these elites have these elite beliefs like globalism and soft Marxism, whatever you have. Do you think that like if we sort of sell the idea that university isn't all the be all and end all, perhaps there might be a reduction in, I want to say, luxury beliefs out there?
Yeah, possibly. I mean, it is true that the universities are a concentrated source of a lot of this kind of damaging ideological messaging. I actually, in my class today, was talking about the inability of socialism or communism to work because that sort of system fails when it scales. But you don't get that in many university classrooms, I think, and definitely if you don't have that kind of exposure to an ideology over and over that you often would if you're a university student, then you're less likely to adopt it, right? If you repeat a lie often enough, you start to believe it, right? So yes, protecting our young people from these damaging ideologies would probably be assisted by not having as many of them in the universities. But of course, they'll be exposed in other ways, including mass media, including social media. So I think it is a more general problem. I think it's something where we need to again think about backing ourselves, believe in ourselves and our own ability to take back the Australia that we used to have. I think in a large amount, even if not completely as as free and free spirited as the U.S. perhaps, and to stand for the principles that we believe in. That is okay. That is, in fact, our duty. In fact, if we want to sleep well at night and look back on our life when we're 95 and say, yes, I've lived well and I've lived for something, that we should decide what our principles are right now and decide that we're going to stand for them. And that means making a few sacrifices along the way. But, you can do it and still be able to feed your family. I mean, I've done that. I feel I've done that. I mean, you can say, well, I'm still working for a mainstream university, so I'm a traitor. Maybe, but I do have to have I have to have a job, right? And I try to use my platform to advocate for principles I think are important. And you can do the same thing in a lot of different professions. You can. It's okay. Sorry. So yeah, you can do that's all right. You can do that same thing in many professions where you speak your mind and you stand up for your family and your community as as an empathic and compassionate but firm member of your society, and recognize your role in making that society healthier. So yeah, I think people can do that. They just have to have a mindset switch.
Sure. How long can we go on? Or do you have to go?
I have to go a little before 6.
Okay, I'll just do one more question then. I suppose when we were talking about the housing crisis, we also talked about high immigration, and we also talked about having the wrong international students. And I'll just sort of share an anecdote from my experience when I was one of 3 local students in my master's course, and if there was 40 in my master's course, I'd say 10 spoke English fluently. This is an English communication course, which I just found incredible. I mean, are they just rubber stamping anybody? Like, is the government that addicted to the sugar hit of GDP at any cost that they'll import just anyone?
Well, I mean, I can't really speak to that in detail because I haven't looked at the requirements and whatnot, but I can say from my own experience in academia that the amount of academic oversight on admissions is probably even less than you imagine. Um, in all of my years working in the Australian higher education sector, I have never been involved in a decision about whether or not to admit someone to our programs. And I've been in all the various roles that are associated with education, in the School of Economics at UNSW, for example, and also at UniSA. I was in many different roles, and those roles aren't involved in admissions. There's just a complete separation. So who does the admissions? It's the university representatives who are in the administration. Some of them actually go in country to the countries that we're trying to get students from and run fairs and do recruitment basically. But this is enabled by the fact that we have an admissions process, which is quite, it's basically a holdover from the years prior when everyone who went to a university in a particular state had graduated high school in that state. And so you can, just say, well, I'll just rank everybody in the state on, the TER or the UAI score or whatever you call it in your state, and I'll just take the top X percent. I'll say, oh, I need to have students who are this good. First of all, it's a reduction of quality to one dimension, which I think is very damaging. It's almost always a bad idea. And secondly, it's assuming that everybody went to high school in that state, which is of course not true for international students. So then the question becomes, how do you translate what the international students have gone through during high school to something approaching a TER or a something score, right? ATAR. And that is where the magic comes in, right? So that's where all the kind of hand waving stuff may happen. And I don't pretend to know exactly how that happens, but I know that there are formulas and, there's a supposed attempt to to make an equivalence. But in my own research, which is now, almost 13 years old, I guess. I found using student populations data, actual data from 2 different universities, not UNSW, but 2 different universities in Australia, business faculties, that the international and non-English language speaking student populations were on average doing worse than the domestic student populations by about 5 marks on the 100-mark scale. So that to me says, well, they're less prepared, I guess, or less able to succeed somehow, right? So that correspondence is not perfect. So there is some kind of a match. I mean, it's not more than 5 marks, and I suppose you could say that things could be worse, right? At least that was 13 years ago. But there's not the kind of admissions process that you have, for example, in the U.S., where you have, at least in some universities, still you have the SAT or ACT standardized test scores. You've got letters of recommendation that need to be written. You have a personal statement that needs to be written. You have the high school transcript, so you can kind of customize the student's background to the particular program that you're offering at your university if you think you want people for that program. So there's a lot more capacity to really holistically assess a candidate, whereas that's not as much true here in Australia. And I think that's part of the way that we've gotten into the pickle that we're in now.
Mm. Yeah, I have watched a lot of American TV shows, and it looks like getting into college is a lot of work. Where it's here, it's just like, here's your thing, and
Yeah.
yeah, you're in, cool, awesome, whatever.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, they have a few programs now that do interviews, but like medicine, for example. So make sure that you
Mm.
can speak English and have a bedside manner, right?
Yeah,
but that's pretty unusual in Australia.
yeah, definitely. Awesome. Thank you so much for your time, Professor Foster. It was great talking to you. Really fascinating discussion. Where can people find your writing and generally where you hang out online?
Yeah, so I'm not really a great social media user. So I'm not on Twitter or Insta or anything like this or Facebook, but I do have a profile on UNSW, and I also have a profile on Brownstone. So if you go to Brownstone Institute, brownstone.org, and just look for me as a contributing author, you can see a lot of blogs there. And you can also find my work in Science and Freedom, which is Australians for Science and Freedom, just scienceandfreedom.org with an AND, all one word, scienceandfreedom.org. If you want to check out the New University Project, that's liberamentis.org. And you can find my books on Amazon. So, and also if you just Google me, you'll find a lot of information, for
Fantastic.
better or for worse.
Great. Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me.
And you can read all the other libertarian battle tested ideas on libertyedge.com, including commentary by Professor Foster on the latest post about housing. Thank you so much again.